Welcome back to Get in the Mecha, and in today's episode we are back and we're talking about OVAs once again. This is the third installment of our very loose OVA series, which we've begun and we've kind of done for two other episodes, in which I've just spoken about a bunch of OVAs which I really liked and things we could really learn from them. This week, I don't have anything really rigid besides the fact that I'm talking about two OVAs in which come from the early 90s. And these OVAs are, of course, Kyō Kara Ore Wa and Record of Lodoss War. This isn't exactly a comparative analysis or anything of the sort. I just really want to look at both of these and see why they work, kind of how they work. And also, I really want to learn see what we can learn about when it comes to storytelling and direction, and just find a few nuggets we can take from both these really great OVAs. Let's hop right into one of my new favorite OVAs, Kyō Kara Ore Wa, or in English, Today I Will, or Today I'll. It's among that tier for me, kind of like Tenemonia Voyages, as I always mention now. I've kind of made that show my personality, as well as some of the OVAs from Akiki Shimbo, even though perhaps those aren't really perfect, but they're pretty damn good. And of course, Gosenzo Sama Babanzai, Mamoru Oshie's maybe I would say masterpiece as well. I would say Kyō Kara Ore Wa, relative to those two OVAs which I really like, is more like Tenemonia Voyages, not because the narratives are anywhere near similar, but just simply because they're much easier to understand what's going on, relative to Gosenzo Sama Babanzai, which is a really complex piece of metafiction. I wouldn't go in uninitiated if you wanted to experience that show. But narrative-wise, it's very straightforward. We have two boys, namely Mitsuhashi and Ito, and they move to a new town, and that obviously means moving to a new school district. Both of them have the intention of becoming these new delinquents, and they both walk into salons right next to each other. And get these really crazy hairstyles. And it's basically their quest to become the next bad boys of the town. And that quest begins, they become friends, kind of. And things pop off from there. The delinquent subgenre, I want to call it, I don't know, it's like calling school anime a genre, which I don't know whether that makes sense technically or not, but I'm going to call it a subgenre, at least that it's a niche within the school anime niche, is one that I have never really dived into before. As of now, Tokyo Revengers has recently finished its first anime season, and the manga is doing really well, I've seen from the sales. However, I wanted to try something perhaps a bit different. I don't think I was very interested in watching 25 or so episodes or however many of Tokyo Revengers. Nothing against the show, of course, but I also like watching shorter things, and I've really been enjoying, of course, these OVAs. I've just been enjoying the stuff of the 90s and 80s so much lately that I wanted to try something that perhaps wasn't in the mainstream, or something like in the present. And that is what led me to watching something which I've planned to watch for quite a while, but I just never really took the plunge, and now I am here watching Kyō Kara Ore Wa. The first thing that kind of hits you when you start watching this OVA is the fact that the episodes are over 24 minutes. Remember, this is not a TV anime, and hence the lengths are usually a bit more flexible, and in this case, it's really satisfying to have episodes that kind of, some of them even reach an hour, and it is really fun, honestly. The lengths are a bit more arbitrary, and it really allows them to like build up to things in a much more, I would say, timely fashion, as I would say 24 minutes, or at least about 18 for a TV show, sometimes can feel a bit too short, and having perhaps an hour or 40 minutes or 35 even to explore a specific conflict or explore a very specific battle or even just person is really fun. Often in these conflicts between schools, and obviously Mitsuhashi and Ito fighting some of the other characters, you get to really see the, I don't say repercussions, but you get to see the wider effects of these conflicts. Because you have schools that know other schools, it's a connected school district, you get to see the reactions of other people that perhaps aren't involved in the conflicts, or people that get roped into the conflict, and all these other shenanigans that makes this show really enjoyable. What I really love about these extended episodes is the fact that it's able to build up to these really big moments, at least from the like direction point of view. And I feel like directors Masami Yano and Takeshi Mori is mostly responsible for the storyboards in this show. I think they knew this, and hence they really saved the best stuff for last. And the climax is something that I don't think I've ever really experienced before. It really just is mind-blowing, honestly. I suppose these are two directors that have been able to adapt to this format, and I think that's really what media production is all about, adapting to one's circumstances. And when you're given these extended episodes to work on, you take advantage of that, and they do exactly that in this show, and it shows, honestly. The moment I always think back to when it comes to the conclusion of this is a part which is in the first part of the OVA. And I dub it the Akehisa Arc. They're fighting, you probably guessed it, they're fighting a school called Akehisa, at least the delinquents from that school, hence Akehisa Arc. They're fighting at night when a train is passing by, and the color scheme, the timing, everything is just so phenomenal, from these dark green colors as when they're fighting and shouting at each other to the dark blues as well of the night sky in this, I would say, maybe urban area, and the color contrast and everything. It sets the stage. This entire episode sets the stage for this really, or 2 episodes, because it's basically a 2-part arc. It sets the stage for this really great finale in which these 2 opponents are really duking it out, and they're properly serious. You can really see it. But to understand this, though, I think we have to get to the root of why Kyō Kara Ore Wa is able to do this. Consider that this is a comedy anime. I think often with comedy anime, it's easy to make the assumption that it can't really bend into, at least move into more perhaps serious moments and be a bit more serious, but this show really can. And how does it do that? That's the question I really want to answer. And it's a bit of a vague idea, but I would say that it's a bit of those "that's what they say" sort of things. It's a bit of like pseudo logic, but I think it really applies to Kyō Kara Ore Wa. It's the idea that these comedic pieces and even comedians just in general have really mastered this idea of like manipulating the emotions of people to the point to which they can kind of manipulate people's emotions in almost any way possible. And I've heard this about comedians making really great actors as a result of being able to do this. And I feel like it really applies to this show as well. This anime does have a bit of a formulaic nature. It's a guy bumps into another guy, they don't like each other, they're from other schools, you're messing with our school, they get into a fight, they involve other people, they fight some more, and eventually the fight ends. That's most of this anime. I'd say that's about 70% of it, and that does sound boring, but I feel like all the comedy woven into it and all the funny moments are really great, and they really managed to bring us on side. And then when it's able to break away from that, that's when I feel like, because it's got us into this trap of, again, manipulating our emotions, or whatever you want to call it, that's when this show manages to shine at its best. And hence you really have to get people into a certain routine and kind of convince that things are going to go one way and then completely move the other way. But because you've hooked them onto it, they're able to kind of carry on for the ride. I'd say we've seen this before, though, in some more recent comedy anime. The 2 I'd mention off the top of my head would be like Kaguya-sama Love is a War and Uramichi Onisan. Once the comedic layers have been established, kind of just like Kyō Kara Ore Wa, which it does throughout the show, I feel like the anime could basically talk about anything. With Uramichi Onisan, when you have Uramichi, the main character, basically opening up about his mental health to the audience, this show, because it's really taken us in and gotten us really close, it's able to branch out into these other topics. And the same goes for I would say the fireworks scene at the end of the finale of season 1 in Kaguya-sama, and when like Chika is crying as well in one of the episodes in season 2 as well. Long story short, I think the best comedy anime are really great at pivoting from very serious topics, or perhaps just really serious tense moments, and really dramatic ones to, again, the much more light and comedic ones. And overall, I think Kyō Kara Ore Wa has allowed me to realize this, and hence my view on comedy has broadened as a result. I know that explanation was a bit all over the place, so let's move on to something perhaps a bit more, I would say, stripped back. Still pretty dense, but a bit more stripped back, and that is Record of Lodoss War. This is certainly a much more popular OVA. I'd put it in the popularity, maybe of that of Gunbuster and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I might be overstepping there, but you get what I'm trying to say. It's a pretty popular one, and I've heard through the grapevine that it's pretty significant, like historically as well. Some have even suggested that it's a really major staple in the fantasy genre of anime, and I don't really have any sources to confirm that, and hence I'm saying that I've heard it. Honestly, if that's the case, I would certainly believe it. People also say, and I hear this fact all the time, that it's based off a D&D campaign. I think they're more so referring to the novels more than anything. And again, I would get what you're saying. It very much plays into that sort of style. If I was to be 100% honest, Lodoss War is pretty simple-ish from a narrative perspective, or at least it plays out in practice quite simply. A party of individuals in this land called Lodoss, which is created through the struggle between light and dark, join the fight in the struggle between light and dark that's been ongoing. And it's basically the conflict between good and bad, good and evil, etc. You know this deal already. It is a very binary black and white sort of show, and you can probably predict how it plays out without actually watching the show itself. And the same really goes for the characters. They are pretty archetypal and they do what you'd expect. You have the various classes and roles, and they all act kind of stereotypically like what they would do in their class role if you were to play any sort of role-playing game or Dungeons and Dragons, etc. But that isn't really what is special about this anime. I'm not bringing this anime here just to dunk on it and say that it isn't good, because it is good. But that isn't what is so great about it, or what is so good about it. What it really is that it nails the execution, and that's mainly from the technical and visual point of view. Lodoss War actually has a series of directors, but that's all brought together by chief director Akinori Nageoka. And overall, the show has some really notable names on it. From across the board, I could cite quite a few. For example, Rintaro, who you might know from X, as well as Download and Gemma and so on, who's responsible for the storyboards on episodes 3 and 7. We have Yutaka Izubuchi, who you might know from directing the mecha anime Ra Zephon, and they are on the character design team. They're also on the dragon design team, which I'm not gonna lie, I feel like a dragon design team, even though it's probably necessary for a show like this, feels like a massive flex. Like, just to say we have a dragon design team that's separate. We also have Hiroyuki Okura, who features as an animation director on episode 3, and some consider Okura potentially one of maybe the best animators ever, or at least one of the best animators in Japan and on Japanese anime, or even just in the world. And we can even pivot to animators as well, such as Toshiyuki Inoue, who is also, I would say, one of the best animators in Japan, maybe in the world. So this anime, from the production point of view, is no joke. It knows what it's doing. But besides the actual credits themselves, one of the biggest pull factors for me was the character designs on this show. Izubuchi and Nobuteru Yuki's designs are full of conviction, and they're beautifully expressive in how sharp they are, and that really helps the show, because I'd say these designs are really complex, and of course, as we know, that complex designs can be very difficult for animation. That being said, though, I think these are the sorts of designs we're not really treated to as much in the landscape these days, at least today. And it really goes to show, though, how a really strong team can kind of overcome what is assumed, or at least known to be typically a pretty difficult hurdle to get over, being complex character designs. How do we animate these? How do we make these work for us? And by that, the way you do that is you get some of the best together. And that is what this OVA is, and I think it's really great proof of that. I know I said I wasn't going to do too much of a comparison with Kyō Kara Ore Wa, but I want to point out something really in particular, and it's how I would say the show's weight and presence, or at least Lodoss War's weight and presence, isn't really circumstantial like that of, say, Kyō Kara Ore Wa, which I say is much more flexible and fluid. Sometimes it is pretty serious, or it tries to be, and then other times it moves a bit, it pivots to being, light and funny and mischievous. And Lodoss War, however, is a very different sort of anime. It has this quite serious and rather epic tone, you could say. It has one key. It plays it in one note. There isn't this constant switching. Obviously, there are many shows that have comedy in them, but I mean, in terms of the overall nature of this show, it is simply one note. And that isn't a bad thing. If anything, again, the execution allows it to kind of consistently have this feeling of the world is at stake and we're in danger, and it really manages to keep us in it and immersed, as opposed to Kyō Kara Ore Wa, which does keep us immersed, but through a very different tactic. These shows have very different priorities, and that really becomes apparent in the second half of Lodoss War, which I would say is really where this show shines, honestly, from a visual point of view. Probably my favorite episode of this anime, and the one with my favorite visual moments, comes from episode 8, which is storyboarded, directed, and even animation directed, so they have the whole trio going, directed by Hirotsugu Kawasaki. Something I'm very fond of when it comes to Kawasaki's episode is the lighting, especially after watching loads of pre-Shaft Akiyuki Shimbo work, as we mentioned 2 weeks ago. I'm starting to recognize these things more, and they become so much more apparent. And I think that really comes from the very distant shadows and silhouettes which they use. They get a lot of mileage out of it, as I'd say that this show does kind of have some mysteries in there and some nuggets that we don't exactly know or are going to be told about, and hence that really manages to keep the mystery going. It is quite an obvious thing when it comes to the use of silhouettes. That's like probably the main use to obscure what the thing is until perhaps a later period, but it really works well for Lodoss War, which has quite a few secrets and things that aren't fully explained, which I'll give it a pass on that. There's some things I wish it did a bit more of in talking about, but I would say that it manages to shroud it in a nice mystery at least, and it's pretty good at portraying that. I would say my favorite shot in this OVA is this shot capturing this speech from the main antagonist slash villain slash anti-hero, don't really know where she stands, Kala, and that's accompanied with these silhouettes, but it's more than just the silhouettes. It's the fact that they're able to smoothly transition and show these scenes of her past while keeping them in shot. And they do that by having these backgrounds, or at least almost, I don't call it slideshow, but you have these backgrounds which narrate basically visually the story of what she's trying to explain to our main character Pan, and that's going behind these pillars as well. So while they're suspended in this discussion, we're having all these things show behind them. I'm sure this has been done elsewhere, but this really takes me back to the 4-part drama directed by Madhouse director Morio Asuka, Ningen Shikaku, as a part of the Aibangeku, or Blue Literature anthology, and it basically is kind of a similar setup, as in they're having a conversation in the main character's room in the house, and in the window is used for displaying the main character's state of mind and basically psychology as they're narrating said thing. I believe they're talking about art and so on, as he is an artist, and while he's saying these things, the things are showing in the window as well as to what he's thinking, and it's quite corrupt thought. It's pretty deep 4-part drama, but it's just a really great way of solving the problem of perhaps not being able to tap into what the characters are thinking and what they're trying to say. And I think that it's a really effective thing to do. It's not something that is always required, but it's, if we think of direction kind of as this problem solving exercise about kind of trying to keep the viewer on side and get people to really invest into the show, this solves the problem of that in part by kind of, again, showing us the psychology, showing us the things they're trying to say, and kind of bridging that gap between showing and telling. which is really important, I would say, for anime and sort of visual media as a whole. I feel as if the best directors and artists really know how to find that sweet spot in the middle of between showing and telling, and Kawasaki makes it really clear that they found that in this episode. Episode 8 is my favorite episode in the show, and it's just a small glimpse of what this show is capable of in terms of how it, quote, nails the execution, as it said before, and creates this really great presence. So what can we really learn from these OVAs? And I have to say, for me, it comes down to the fact that atmosphere is everything. I try not to use terms like atmosphere and vibe and, okay, maybe not mood. Mood, I think, is a good term, but I think they are pretty vague. What is an atmosphere? What is a vibe necessarily? I think it's really just a mixture of all these things when it comes to like audio and visuals and so on. And hence, I feel like it's better to perhaps say what those things are as opposed to saying, it's a great vibe. But I feel like this time I kind of have to give into that and say that vibe and atmosphere is everything for a show. It's about the presence that it creates. And that presence is what keeps us really involved in the show. When we look at these two shows side to side, Kyō Kara Ore Wa is perhaps much more fluid in its vibe and atmosphere. Relative to, of course, Record of Lodoss War, which is much more has a much more single unitary vibe and atmosphere. I think I sometimes have a tendency to view film, TV, etc. as this very static thing, where it has one presence. It remains in this single presence. It doesn't really shift between presences, when in reality, shows can do that, and Kyō Kara Ore Wa really opened my eyes up to this and how you're able to flick the switch between two different vibes and get a bit more serious when necessary, show the audience a completely different side to this anime relative to something like Lodoss War, which fits my perhaps previous understanding of this. That being said, I don't want it to make it sound like Lodoss War is perhaps basic because it has one singular presence, because what is really great about Lodoss War is that it's able to nail a very specific thing and do it really well. And I think that's really important for anime. If you're able, I would much rather nail one thing really well and play it safe rather than trying to do all these different things and introduce all these different elements that don't quite click together. So you could argue, even though I wouldn't really agree, that it plays it kind of safe. But that is, again, the beauty of Lodoss War. It's fantasy done really well and told really well. Not incredibly ambitious from the perspective of narrative, but beautiful from the perspective of execution. OVAs come in so many different shapes and sizes. I say that almost every time we talk about OVAs. I know, I still agree with it. But I would say that they still have a kind of similar common ground, and it's not even an OVA thing. This is a media thing. It's just the fact that they all want to tell a really great story in which one won't forget. However, of course, the means of getting there is very different. Whether we have the Lodoss War approach, which is kind of about getting the viewer immersed in the world and really taking it as almost as realistically as possible, or Kyō Kara Ore Wa's approach, which is really like this hook approach of, getting them really invested in the comedy and then shifting them around and so on, because you've managed to really capture their emotions and really get them invested as a result of like the comedic genius of the show. Even if the journey is incredibly different, they all have that same end goal in mind, and that's what these two OVAs really made apparent for me. With that being said, that is another episode of Getting the Mecha in the Bag. Hopefully you did enjoy this episode. As always, if you did, like, review, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. And also thank you for the support in the last episode as well. That did really good. I'm really happy loads of people enjoyed listening to me talk about Heiki Monogatari on this podcast. So thank you for that. And yeah, have a great rest of your week. Whatever you're doing, just have a great day. And I will see you next time on Getting the Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows. Synthwave by Alex McCulloch.